Hey, y'all, and welcome back to the show. I am your host, Megan Hardy, and I'm the founder of Fitness Uncharted, which is my fitness and nutrition coaching company that I designed to help women build muscle, lose fat, and improve your metabolism so that you can feel healthy and confident and have complete food freedom. And today, guys, we're going to be talking about food substitutions to help you hit your macro goals. So, this is actually a topic that came up with a client recently because she's a little bit newer to tracking macros. And she was like, I'm having a hard time knowing what I can substitute for certain foods to still fall within my macro ranges. So, I'm going to turn this into a podcast episode. And it's kind of a hard topic to turn into a podcast episode because I find it's like helpful to have more like real life examples. So I will give y'all some examples, but I'm going to kind of give you some principles to help you with food substitutions that can help you with staying within your macro goals or hitting your macro targets. And I have to go ahead and apologize in advance. I still sound a little like stuffy, and I'm getting over having the flu and then now have some bronchitis type mess going on, something bronchial with my lungs. So I'm like wheezing on like every inhale still. It's going on like 2 weeks now of this crap. Apparently, my sister told me that the flu is up 280% this year, flu cases. And I'm like, yeah, I'd believe it because it's just ridiculous. Everyone and their mom, when I posted on social media that I was sick, I think I got like 100 messages from people, probably not that many, but a lot of messages like, oh, my daughter's sick, my son is sick, I'm sick, my whole family's sick. Oh my gosh, we had that for 10 weeks. It sucked. And I'm like, yeah, yay, thank you. So anyway, I'm gonna do my best to not cough your ears off. But sometimes I just can't help it. It just strikes and it strikes hard. And I'm gonna sound like a barking dog, but it's fine. So let's jump on in. The first tip on food substitutions. This is really the key. Like this would be probably, we could probably start and end with this tip is to get familiar with single macro foods. And that way you can quickly and easily get your macros back on track. So, what is a single macro food? It's basically a food that is primarily one macronutrient, one single macronutrient. Most foods are a combination of all three or at least two macronutrients. So, for instance, eggs, right? Let's just take eggs, for example. They're a combination of primarily protein and then fats, right? So, it's a fat source and a protein source. Egg whites, on the other hand, that is something we would call a single macro food because it's really like all protein, a protein source. So I'm going to give you guys some examples of some single macro foods, all of which you will be familiar with. You may have just not thought of it in this way. But I will say, even all of these foods that I'm about to give you examples of for each macro, they still have a few grams, most of them still have a few grams of the other two macronutrients other than the primary one, but they're negligible, compared to how much of that food is the single macro. Okay. So get familiar with these and incorporate them when you are trying to substitute foods to hit certain macros. It's really helpful to use these single macro foods. Like some of y'all, for instance, be like, I don't know, how do I replace all the macros in this sushi roll, casserole, pasta roll? And I'm like, homie, I don't know what's in your sushi roll casserole. So let's like simplify it, right? Like when we're trying to make a substitution to hit certain macronutrients, we probably need to simplify the foods a little bit. So, for instance, for proteins, some single macro foods. So, we already mentioned egg whites, chicken or turkey breast. You've probably thought of that too, right? When you think of a protein source, whitefish, canned tuna, shrimp, scallops, ground turkey. You want to go like 99% lean here, or at least like 97% lean is usually what I do. There's also like the 93% lean, which is still a good choice. But obviously, the less lean that you go, then that means there's more fat content, right? So if you were really trying to go for a single macronutrient protein food, you want the higher percent lean to help with that. So all of those foods I just listed, and there's more that I could add to that list too, are single macro protein foods. So if you're low on protein and you're like but you're really like pretty maxed at your calories. Like let's say you have like 200 calories left and you still have however many grams of protein, you probably want to go for a single macro protein food, like one of these, versus something that's a higher fat content, like a bunch of whole eggs or a steak or something like that, that's going to be higher fat and protein. Because that means that in order to hit your protein numbers, you're probably going well over your calorie intake for the day. And in our hierarchy of importance, calories is at the top still. It pretty much goes calories and then protein and then carbs and fats. And then, of course, we have like our micronutrients in there too, like our vitamins and minerals, making sure we're eating mostly whole foods. But, if you're low in protein, aim for some of these single macro protein options. And then some carb examples. So, more of a single macro carb option would be things like white rice, brown rice, oats, quinoa, fruits and vegetables, even snack foods like rice cakes or popcorn or pretzels. Those are all really single macro, like carb foods. So, I'm a fan of, adding in some rice cakes when I need some carbs, right? Or if I'm feeling snacky or whatever, popcorn as well. Carbs are actually the harder macronutrient for me to hit. I always tend to blow through my protein, and then fats are no problem. But carbs are actually the one I have to be more intentional to get my carb intake up. So if I was intentionally wanting to add more of this macronutrient without adding a bunch of fats or protein, these would be some single macro carb options. Like I said, these foods are nearly pure carb and they can be used to meet those carbohydrate macro goals without significantly affecting protein or fat intake, even though there may be a few grams of protein or fat in them, right? It's pretty negligible and it'll help you hit your pure carb intake. And then for fats, for single macro fat options, that think things like oils, so like your avocado oil, coconut oil, olive oil, y'all, those kind of fats, we'll talk more about this in a second too, but are really great, especially if you're not feeling hungry and you still have a lot of calories left over, or you need to fill your macros and your calories. A little bit of oil goes a long way, calorie wise and fats wise. So, oils, nuts and seeds, nut butters, avocado, dairy based fats like butter or ghee, those are all great fat options. And those are going to help you hit your fat goals. I find for the most part, most people aren't challenged with hitting their fats goals unless if their mindset is that fats are bad for you or fats will make you fat. If you're coming from that background, then it's a mindset shift to increase your fat intake. But if you're eating some like higher fat meat sources and protein sources and eggs and things like that and cooking with oils, most people don't have any problem hitting their fat goals. So, but this is something to look at too. If you're really going over on your fats, you may actually want to reduce some of these single macro fat foods, right? Like maybe you're swapping out certain oils for a less fatty option. Maybe you're not having nuts and seeds as a snack, right? Even though nuts and seeds isn't a bad snack option, maybe you're replacing that with a higher protein or carb food because these are more single macro fat food items. Okay. So, you want to keep these. What I would recommend is keep these single macro foods on hand for easy substitution. So, if you're trying to substitute with like multi macro foods, that can be a lot more challenging, especially if you have limited calories left. The fats and carbs, those are pretty easy to keep on hand and really require like little to no prep. So, nuts and seeds, having fruits and vegetables on hand, right? Things like that. They really require no prep. And then the protein sources, they may require some prep, but it's still relatively quick and easy. Like that's why if you listen to the meal prep episode I did, I think that's like oh gosh, maybe episode 7 or something. I don't know. It's earlier on. I did a simplified meal prep episode. So go back and listen to that. But I recommend bulk prepping 2 to 3 single macro protein sources at the beginning of your week or throughout the week, just like in advance, so that you easily have those on hand ready to go. So think, again, your chicken breast or your ground chicken or ground turkey, your canned tuna, whatever, you have those protein sources ready to go when you need those single macro foods. So that is one of like the biggest recommendations is keep those on hand. If you're constantly trying to use multi macro foods to swap in and out, that, are high protein carb fat or high protein fat, and then you're trying to switch it with a high, you know, fat carb source or whatever, it gets a lot more confusing. So have those single macro foods on hand. And then my next suggestion for you is to hit your more difficult macro targets first to prepare in advance for any deviation from your plan. So, like, pay attention to which macro targets you are more likely to exceed on a normal day. Like, we all have them, right? Like, some of us tend to go over our fats, or some of us tend to go over our carbs. Pay attention to that. For example, like, if you struggle to get your protein before maxing out your fat allotment for the day, I see this super often. This is probably one of the biggest ones is people are like, how do I hit my protein without going like way over on my fats? If you find that happens for you, then make sure you focus on protein before fat. And that's where the nuance comes in. That's where this is totally a learning curve. Give yourself grace if you are newer to macros. And even if you're not, don't get too hung up on the numbers. But like, just this is where the learning curve and the nuance starts to come in. And if you notice that you're struggling to hit your protein, you may benefit from front loading your protein for the day and then also incorporating more of these single macro protein foods that have lower fat content. So, hands down, every time I look at a client who's struggling with hitting their protein without going over on fats, if I look through their food log for the week, I basically swap out, 75% of their protein sources because they're eating a lot of high fat protein sources. And I'm like, well, that makes sense. And then also, they might be not even noticing certain things like the dressings or the oils and whatever. And also, guys, make sure you're tracking that stuff because if you're not tracking your cooking oils, you are definitely missing out on a lot of the fats that you're actually going even more over your fats for sure. But front loading your protein, that's helpful too. I always say start with a super, super high protein breakfast. You can never go wrong with that because at the end of the day, maybe you're like, oh, shoot, I've already hit my protein goal. If you go over protein, I always say, don't worry about it. It's fine. If you go over your protein a little bit. And then if at the end of the day, like you're not playing catch up either way, right? You're either more likely to hit your protein target or you might even be going over it a little bit. But front loading protein is super helpful. And then also using some more of those single macro protein food items is going to be really helpful too. So if again, look at your history, look at your data. What does the data tell you? Are you the person who goes over on carbs? Are you under on protein? Like, what macros do you struggle with? And then let's figure out some solutions based off of that, right? So I'm going to give you some other quick examples here. So one example, let's assume you're slightly over on fats and you need to reduce your fat intake while maintaining protein and carbs. Okay, this is the classic example because this happens often. Let's say your original meal was grilled salmon and brown rice, avocado, and steamed broccoli. Okay, we're just keeping it pretty traditional over here. So very basic, right? All of those are pretty easy things to track. That's another thing, you guys, if you're newer to macros, keep it more simple up front and like track things that are just going to make your life easier to track versus really complicated recipes. Anyway, but okay, let's say salmon, brown rice, avocado, and steamed broccoli. You could replace the salmon and avocado with leaner options like grilled chicken breast and cucumber slices to keep your protein high and get your fat content down. So when you hear that salmon, brown rice, avocado, and broccoli, where are the fat sources? It's the salmon and it's the avocado, right? Those are those higher fat sources. So if I need to keep my protein up but get my fats down, then I could easily swap out the salmon for chicken breast and then swap out the avocado for some other kind of veggie. And I just said sliced cucumbers, but something that's just more of a carb source. And If I'm worried about calories too, I can go for one of those high volume, lower calorie carb sources like, cruciferous veggies or, leafy greens or something like that. Right. So there's an example. If you're over your fats, but you need to keep protein high, what could you do with that meal? Right. Or for another example, let's say your goal is to increase carbs while keeping fats and protein the same. Like this would be someone like me who actually struggles to hit my carb intake. And I love carbs. I like carbs, but my carb goals are higher. And I also just love protein, so I like crush protein. But let's say your original meal was grilled chicken breast, quinoa, and asparagus. Okay, again, keeping it simple. You could substitute the quinoa with a higher carb grain or a starchy veggie like sweet potato or regular potatoes, whatever, to increase your carbs while maintaining protein and fat levels. So, quinoa is actually not one of the higher carb grains. So, if you are looking at that and you're like, how do I increase my carbs? I'm already having a carb source here, but how do I just not have to like eat like 4 cups of quinoa? Well, look for a higher carb source, higher carb option. And again, you could go with a higher carb grain or a starchy veggie. That's going to get you more carb intake. And that's going to help you stay around the same calories, but and keep your carbs up while also maintaining your fats and protein sources too. So that's another example. Or last but not least, let's say you've already hit your protein goal and you still have leftover calories. Okay. I get this sometimes and it always makes me smile. Um, you've hit your protein, but you have leftover calories. People are like, what should I do? Oh my gosh, how do I hit the rest of my calories without going over protein? And I'm like, have fun. But for real, it's super easy to fill your carb and fat intake. Like I'm always just like, enjoy yourself, have a good day, because it's very easy to fill carbs and fats for the most part, right? Of course, you still want to do. I'm half joking because you don't want to just go eat donuts to fill your carbs and fats, but it is pretty simple to fill those macronutrients. And I always tell my clients, if you go over your protein goal, don't worry about it. So, for instance, let's say you've already gone over your protein a few grams for the day, but you still have like 300 calories left, and you decide to eat some snacks that are mostly carb and fat intake, but they're going to have some protein, in there as well. And you're like, well, shoot, I'm already over my protein. So what do I do? It's fine. It's negligible. Like, and also, again, I'm always telling my clients if you're going over protein, that's the one macro that's probably the most forgiving, like in that sense. And you'd have to eat a ton of protein or go way over calories for it to have like negative outcomes. So don't worry about it if that's the case for you. And for many of my clients, also, you guys, I will say we don't even track specific fat and carb ratios. As long as they are hitting protein and calories and they're eating mostly whole foods, like 80 to 90% whole foods, we don't even often set a fat or carb target. We're setting a calorie and a protein target. So if that is helpful for you to stop stressing over exact macro ratios, then do that. Like take that stress off. Sometimes it really does feel when you're doing all 3 macronutrients plus calories like a Rubik's cube. And for the most people, it doesn't matter as much. I will say, depending on what season of life you're in, like for my perimenopausal or menopausal clients, we might want to do a little bit moderately to higher fats, a little bit moderate to lower carb, um, things like that, where, yeah, we do want to look at those numbers. But unless you're like looking to compete in a bodybuilding or a bikini competition, you probably may not even need to stress over the specific carb and fat ratios as long as you are eating mostly whole foods, mostly complex carbs, and mostly healthy fats. And if that helps you mentally to just aim for mostly whole foods plus a calorie and protein goal, then do that because you're going to probably see results just from that. You will see results just from that if your calories and protein are where they need to be and your training is where it needs to be. Okay. Also, use MyFitnessPal as your friend. It is your friend or whatever tracking app you're using. But personally, I have an in-app tracking feature with my app, and then also MyFitnessPal. We have an integration with that into my app, so that's why I prefer it. I also think it is very user friendly now too. But look up those single macro food items in MyFitnessPal to figure out how many grams or ounces you need of that food item to hit your macro goal. I will say I am not a numbers person. I do not naturally just remember numbers. So even for myself, if I'm tracking, I'm going to go search and have to look up, okay, how many grams or ounces are going to get me to my, carb gram goal or my, calorie intake goal for this certain food item. Like, how much of this do I need to be eating? And then, of course, you can use your food scale and weigh it out and make sure that, you're not eating 800 grams of sweet potato or something because like 150 grams is like more of a serving, right? So you want to make sure what you're like plugging in is actually realistic for you to eat. But that's where MyFitnessPal comes in super handy for you to start to learn those numbers. And then also, like I said, I'm not remembering all these numbers off the top of my head. I'm using the tool, the tracking tool as my resource as well. So you can use that, literally use Google to cross-reference yourself. Again, like if you pull up in MyFitnessPal, a certain number of grams to hit your let's say, or let's just say ounces to keep it simple. Let's say like you're like, okay, 5 ounces of sweet potato is, you want to see how many grams of carbs that is, right? So you plug, 5 ounces of sweet potato in, you see how many grams of carbs it is. And then let's say you're like, in reality, you don't really know how much 5 ounces of sweet potato, like what that looks like. Go to Google and type in 5 ounces of sweet potato is how much, or is how many calories, or is how many carbs, right? And it'll give you results with feedback too. So you can double check yourself that way as well. It seems really like simple, but it actually works and it's helpful if you're like second guessing or questioning yourself or getting confused by the numbers, right? So use it to your advantage. Also, two really quick tips for you guys, whether you are someone who's like in a reverse diet or you're struggling with eating enough food. I have a tip for you. Or if you're the person who's in a cut or a calorie deficit and you're trying to be strategic with your calories and macros to stay within your deficit, I have a tip for you too. So, first, if you are really struggling with eating enough food and you're just not feeling hungry, but you have leftover calories and macros you're trying to hit, choose more energy dense foods. If you have large amounts of macros remaining, and if you're not feeling hungry, those energy dense foods are gonna be really helpful. So think things like your nuts and nut butters, your oils, like we talked about, full fat Greek yogurt. So this is the time to enjoy that full fat goodness, right? Or like whole eggs. So I'm a huge proponent of whole eggs. But personally, in the mornings, I do a couple whole eggs plus egg whites because I want some of the yolk and the fat because there's a lot of nutrient density there. But I also want more of this the strictly protein source too, right? But if you're struggling with your hitting your calories because you're full, eat a bunch of whole eggs because you're going to get a lot of the fat content, higher calorie content from the whole egg. Also, salmon, steak, like enjoy some of those fattier fish and fattier meats. So those things will add up very quickly. That's when sometimes when people are tracking and they're like, saying that they had a really hard time, hitting calories. I'm like, let's look really quickly because I could show you where to add a tablespoon of oil here or there and you're going to easily hit the rest of your calories and really hardly notice it because it's not a bunch of high volume food. It's very calorie dense, energy dense foods, right? So that's a tip if you are struggling with your hunger or eating enough calories. And then if you are in a cut or a calorie deficit and you're trying to stay within your calorie range, then choose high volume foods when you are near hitting your goals and you find yourself hungry. High volume foods are going to be your best friend. Okay. I personally hate being in a deficit. I love food. I don't like to cut my calories, and high volume foods are a lifesaver for me. They're actually a lifesaver for me at maintenance too, because again, I'm a volume eater. I like to eat a lot of food when I eat. That might sound barbaric or gross, but I like a lot of food and I want to eat a lot. Even if it was a very satisfying meal, if it wasn't much food on my plate, I'm like, I ain't full. Like it's just, it's a mind thing too, right? So choose high volume foods, things like non starchy veggies. So, non starch veggies, leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables. Those are really high volume. Do watch out, like pounding too much broccoli or cauliflower. You're probably going to have major like GI upset and like indigestion. So, do watch out to not pound too much of that. Berries, melons, again, like I mentioned, egg whites, non-fat Greek yogurt. So when you're in a deficit, try to cut out some of more of those high fat options to help with your calorie range. So non-fat yogurt, chicken, shrimp, as far as snacks, popcorns and rice cakes are super helpful because they are low calorie, high volume, right? So I'm a huge fan. If you just even think about it, like rice cakes, that's something where you could have, I'm like, oh, I get to have so many of these and it's like so much food. But calorie wise, it's really not that much. Like four rice cakes is like 200 calories. It's like 50 calories a cake, right? So, it still adds up, but you get a lot more of the volume versus, half a serving of nuts and seeds is like easily 200 calories. And I feel like I didn't eat anything, right? So, watch or really aim for more of those high volume foods when you are trying to stay in a deficit or in a cut. So, that is all I have for you guys. I'm going to wrap it up there. I feel like I'm getting even more hoarse as I'm talking. This is probably the most talking I've done all in one sitting in like 2 weeks. So, anyway, hopefully by the time this releases, I'm better. I'm hearing that a lot of you guys are struggling with this for like weeks and weeks on end. And I hope that's not me, but it's kind of looking that way. So, anyway, also last, word of advice or wisdom for you is that you will not hit your macros every day. You guys, spoiler alert, you're not going to hit them every day. And that's a good thing. Honestly, everything should be practiced in moderation. And that also includes hitting your macros. Okay. And especially with something we talk about with our clients, if you're going out to eat, going to a restaurant or something, we even say, like, don't even worry about tracking that meal. If it's the rare occasion and occurrence, but the rest of the time you're super consistent, that's called balance. It's not going to throw you way off, right? Like, just don't eat like an a-hole, go balls to the walls, but like, you don't even really have to track it. It's fine. If 90% of the time you're being consistent and compliant, then good. Have that balance in your life too, right? Don't obsess over the numbers. Even like food labels are allowed to be off by like 20% on the calorie range. It's pretty crazy. So even if you think you're being perfect with your numbers, you're probably not, because even food labels are incorrect, which is very frustrating, especially for my type A people. I'm sorry to tell you that. But, just get as close as you can. Like for us with our clients, we usually say, hey, like try to aim for within once you're getting better at macros, try to aim within like 100 calorie range up or down of your calorie goal. So let's say your goal is 1800 calories. If you're within 1700 and 1900 calories, you've hit your goal, right? You don't need to be perfect. I have some type A clients who, God love them, like they're so great, but they're like, oh, I went 2 grams over my protein goal or like 3 grams over my fats. And I'm like, homie, you hit your fats. That means you hit your fats. Okay. So like try to be within like a 10% variance, basically, right? Or less. Like just try to be close and don't worry about the rest. Okay. Do not obsess over the numbers. You're actually doing more damage than good for your mental health and your relationship with food. And if you find yourself at the end of the day with no way to hit your macros, default back to calories. So if you end up going over on your calories, then the next goal is to minimize the number of excess calories that you eat. So this, for example, would be maybe my person who, again, they have a lot of protein left over because they didn't plan well or they didn't pre-track their food, which is another great piece of advice, is to pre-track your food, track what you plan to eat versus tracking what you ate. That'll ensure that you hit your macros for the day. But let's say you have like 90 grams of protein left to hit, but you only have but so many calories because you really went over on your carbs and fats for the day. do not try to hit all 90 grams of protein. Just try to get closer to your protein goal. But at the end of the day, in the hierarchy, calories are king. Calories are at the top, right? So you don't want to blow through your calories just to hit your protein at the end of the day. And, if you do, go over, don't sweat it. You could eat a little less the following day, or, it's kind of even like calorie cycling. That's a thing as well, where every day doesn't look the exact same. So you could do that, or just forget about it and start fresh tomorrow. Like tomorrow's a new day, and what matters the most is what you're doing consistently most of the time. And the one little day or two that's inconsistent can't ruin or mess up your mostly consistent lifestyle. So if you are newer to tracking, give yourself grace. It is a learning curve, but you will get better. Just don't get frustrated. Also, if you have questions or want help with any of this, then please reach out to me. We do one-on-one nutrition and fitness coaching. This is literally the kind of stuff we are helping our clients with, giving suggestions and substitutions and stuff like that, giving you ideas, holding you accountable to it, not letting you jump ship when you do get a little frustrated with your sushi roll casserole that you don't know how to track, right? So reach out to me. You can shoot me a message on social media, or you can apply for one-on-one coaching. The link is in the show notes for all of that. But otherwise, guys, I'm going to hop off of here because I feel like I sound like a frog. So I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. I hope this was helpful, and I'll catch you on the next episode.